I would like to talk about someone who, well, I'll put it this way. Way back in the 1950s, back when Eisenhower was president, three giants came to Washington, D.C. Two of the three giants people know about, they've heard of, and they're well known. One was Billy Graham. We all remember Billy Graham. And still, right now, the things that he has done, he's done more for Jesus and for God and for the, every time I get a chance to see something on TV that is from one of his past rallies, I do so. So the other one that came there, the three giants that came, was Bill Bright. Now, some of you may not remember who Bill Bright was. He was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. He was the guy that started, people are not aware of this in the general public, but we actually have events where 2 times a week, one's a prayer breakfast and one is a Bible study. Bill Bright was the one who started that. So everyone's heard of Bill Bright and the Campus Crusade for Christ. But the third giant that came in, no one's heard of, and his name was Doug Coe. Now this is Doug Coe. Doug Coe came up there with the other two giants, and he really changed America. Now he died in last February 21st, and I purposely, for an obvious reason that you'll find out in a minute, waited to now to talk very much about him. You see, Doug Coe, people think of him as having been someone who was a great diplomat, and he had political influence and all of that. And there's an article written not long ago, and I'll read this to you because he did things like that, but he did it second only to his real mission in life. The article goes like this: the extent of Coe's influence in American politics is real. Important figures have acknowledged his role on the national and international stage. For instance, speaking at the 1990 National Prayer Breakfast, President George H.W. Bush praised Coe for his quiet diplomacy. You know, I don't ever remember in the years I've known him that he ever raised his voice. He was always a quiet diplomat. Doug Coe was behind-the-scenes player at the Camp David Accords. He was also working with President Jimmy Carter to issue a worldwide call to prayer with Israeli Prime Minister Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Coe met with the top economic officials of Pakistan as a special envoy. Coe met with President George H.W. Bush as he hosted a luncheon with Iraq's ambassador to the United States in the mid-'80s. In 2001, Coe helped arrange a private meeting between two warring leaders. By the way, I was there, so I remember this firsthand. That was the president of Congo, Joe Kabila, and the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame. And I was there because it happened during the National Prayer Breakfast, and he had these two presidents of warring countries in there to talk to them in the spirit of Jesus, and that's when everything broke down. They became friends, and they signed a peace accord, and that was Doug Coe. Doug was a member of a larger United States congressional and ministerial delegation which accompanied then First Lady Hillary Clinton to the 1997 funeral of the founder of the Sisters of Charity, Mother Teresa. He is mentioned by John Ortberg in his book, If You Want to Walk on Water, You Got to Get Out of the Boat. And he talked about, the book was partly about Doug Coe. And he was the guy that was who had a great influence in bringing medicine and releasing political prisoners in Kenya. And we all remember that's happened. So here we have a guy that was bringing warring powers together. He was solving serious problems with the country, and yet that wasn't even his mission. I know I'll lose credibility when I say this, because people think it's impossible. A few people here know it's not impossible because they heard it once before. And that is that Doug Coe has actually taken his mission, which is a Jesus mission, and by the way, Time magazine listed him among the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. But anyway, I'll lose credibility when I say that, in fact, Doug Coe has been to every country in the world. And the reason I know this is I thought We had him one time because Zanzibar actually people think it's a separate country and next to Tanzania. And he never was in Zanzibar, and I was. And then we found out he was right and I was wrong. That was not a separate country. Anyway, he's had this Jesus mission for a long time, since the late 40s. So I want to just mention, I hope and pray that my kids and grandkids, when it comes time for me to cash out, will be as respectful and as loving as his kids and grandkids were at his funeral. We called it a celebration, not a funeral. One of his grandkids, Sam Wagner, he talked about a trip with his grandpa to Nepal. Sam recalled how Doug not only met with dignitaries, but also met with the young kids carrying machine guns who had shut the city down. Justin's a grandson. Justin, he recited a story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. You've heard the story before, and said that Doug reminds him of the little boy in that story. Just as the boy brought his loaves and fish to Jesus, Doug brought all of that he had to Jesus. Doug used to ask his grandson the question, if you give Jesus all of your love, what will happen? You will not run out of love for other people. Rather, Jesus will make your love enough for the whole world. That's a grandson. Gosh, I'd like to have my grandkids feel that way. Melissa, she's a granddaughter. Melissa, at the very last of the event, the celebration that I'm referring to, she's the one who stood up and she said, I don't want you to leave the service talking about Jesus because Doug would certainly have been disappointed if they left talking about him. So anyway, we had people like that. We had famous people at that meeting, by the way. One was this Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner. The first time she met Doug, he talked like he already knew her well and like she already knew Jesus well, even though she had only recently accepted Jesus into her life. But Barbara, this Barbara Skinner. Now, she's a very liberal Democrat. Is a wonderful person, liberal Democrat. And she jokingly said that Doug didn't understand gender because most of his fellow members were men. And he would say to her, we brothers have to stick together. Doug made Barbara pray for Ronald Reagan at the National Prayer Breakfast when Ronald Reagan was president. And even after she told him that she didn't know enough scripture to pray for Republicans, Doug challenged her to confront her skepticism of people of different political beliefs, and she did. You know, he had ways of saying things and getting things done that other people didn't. One of the well-known people that was there at the celebration was Sam Nunn. And we remember Sam Nunn. He was a very well-known United States senator. He's one who really concentrated on rebuilding our national defense when it needed to be rebuilt. And he talked about Doug Coe. He said, Doug formed small fellowships and prayer groups in House, in the Senate, in the Pentagon, in the executive branch, the judicial branch, and he also formed groups globally all over the world. He started many diverse fellowship groups throughout Japan and injected them all with Jesus. Jesus was it with Doug. When Sam told a story about playing golf with Doug. Doug was a good golfer. He was talented. He made bets with the people that he played golf with. And if they lost, they would have to, it wasn't a money deal, they'd have to memorize a Bible verse or go on mission trips. And Doug always wins. And I always will remember what Sam said at the very quietly in a quiet voice. He said, Doug Coe was a sermon we saw. If we look closely, we also saw a glimpse of Jesus. Another guy that was very, very well known to all of us here, known worldwide, is a guy named Ward Brim. Ward Brim he enjoys talking about Doug Coe. He's the one who repeated something that Doug said a long time ago, that George H.W. Bush said a long time ago. He said that Doug Coe has more friends who are heads of state than I do. This is the President of the United States talking. He also said, in one of his favorite quotes, Doug Coe was the most famous person that nobody has ever heard of. Well, anyway, he said, I was telling a story, Ward Brim, he said in an early conversation about Africa, Doug once asked me, he said, if you were God, how would you help all those poor people in Africa? My mind went totally blank, and I stammered. And Doug said, I said, I don't know. Doug said, well, just look, we're not in a hurry. Just think about it for a while. So he said, Ward Brim said, so I did. I thought about it for a while, and my mind was still a blank. So finally, in frustration, I said, I'm not God, so I don't know what I would do. But you seem to know, so you tell, if you were God, how should you help the poor people in Africa? And Doug Coe said very quietly, I would change the hearts of their leaders. Now, here's what Doug did. He didn't just change the hearts of leaders. He changed the hearts of leaders around the world, every country in the world. One man did that. I don't know how that's even possible. You know, another person that was in a different kind of expression, his name was Lee Atwater. Not many people remember Lee Atwater. He was well known in Republican circles. He actually was the chairman of the Republican Party a number of years ago. Now, he was a talented, charismatic guy. He played the guitar, he sang, and everybody just loved him. And he was actually arguably one of the best political mechanics around at that time. But but something bad happened to him. He got leukemia. He knew he was going to die, and he wasn't sure. He said, you know, I'm going to die. I've got to be rational about this thing. I don't know who God is. I don't know who Jesus is. So on Friday, March the 16th, after a White House breakfast, Lee struck up a conversation with the president's secretary. I remember her, Patty Prescott. She suggested that he call Doug Coe. Now, she was suggesting that Lee Atwater call Doug Coe. At that time, he was working with members of Congress on the National Prayer Breakfast. 11 days later, Lee arrived at the Cedars in Virginia, overlooking the Potomac. It served as the headquarters for Doug Coe's Fellowship Foundation. Now, using a cane, Lee Atwater, nearing his death, walked into the main house and sized up his 60-year-old host. And he said, and this is a quote, I've been in this city for many years now, and I never heard of you. Who are you anyhow? He said to Doug. And Doug said, well, we have many mutual friends all over the city. I've heard about you for a long time. And Lee Atwater said, well, what have you heard? Doug replied, I've heard that you are a real SOB. Now, he didn't say SOB. He said the real words. And Doug Coe, for their dialogue began at that time. So from then until August, Lee was deteriorating. And one August day, Lee asked Coe to come to his hospital bed in an emergency. He was dying, and he wanted to find out, what is this deal about Jesus? What is this deal about God? He said when he arrived, Lee looked at him with his best piercing glare, and he said, this Jesus business, is he God or isn't he God? Tell me, someday he's God, some say that he's man. And Doug replied, this is something you've got to decide for yourself, but let me just tell you a little story. And Lee gave Coe his full command focus. You're big on the golden rule, said Doug Coe. Now, let's just say that you are the most powerful figure in the universe. Now, this is Doug Coe talking to Lee Atwater. You are the most powerful person in the universe, and you could say, let there be a star or a planet, and boom, it exists. Or you wanted to create elephants, and boom, there are elephants, or cows, or human beings. Anything you wanted, you had all the power, right? You understand that? So you're sitting up in a cloud somewhere, looking down on earth, and you see these cows grazing in a field, and you decide that you want to be a real companion to those cows. Now, what would you do? All of a sudden, that picture of God becoming man had a clarity of an index card summary. He said, I got it, Lee shouted. Don't tell me anymore, it's very clear, and he died. Doug had a way of saying things that nobody else did. And the last one I'll mention, this is significant to me because I happened to be with Doug at this time, this statement was made. President Museveni is the president of Uganda. He's one, like many of the presidents in Africa, who came through the bush and fought his way up. And he's been, I think, an excellent president. But Doug has told him that, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me. Well, this always bothered President Museveni. And President Museveni said to Doug Coe, he said, look, we can go out here into the bush, and we have villages. They never heard of God. They never heard of Jesus. And are you saying that there's no way that they're going to get to heaven? And Doug told President Museveni a story. He had experienced that he had actually experienced this revelation when he was in the Gobi Desert several years ago to visit Mongolian sheep herders. This is Doug Coe telling the story. He told them that he had a friend who is a shepherd. In fact, he told them that his friend is the greatest shepherd who ever lived. His friend knows all of the flocks, even the names of each sheep. If one of the sheep gets lost, the shepherd leaves the flock to search for the one lost sheep. The Mongolian sheep herders were amazed as Doug told them about this shepherd. The next day, the Mongolian sheep herders told Doug that during the night they had decided to follow this shepherd, but they wanted to know his name. Doug said, well, his name is Jesus. They told Doug that they always knew about him, but they never knew his name. And President Museveni understood what he was talking about. So you see, Doug Coe had a way of explaining things that other people didn't. I was particularly blessed in that for 20 years, I met with Doug every Tuesday for an hour at 5 o'clock. And I was a recipient of all this brilliance that this guy had. In the political philosophy of Jesus, I called it that. Doug didn't call it that. But it's all scripturally based. It's got Acts 9:15 says, what did Jesus say to Paul on the road to Damascus? He said, take my name to the kings. And so Doug spent all those years in every country in the world taking his name to the kings. Acts 2:42, that's the genesis of these small meetings that we have. Not many people are aware that here in the United States Senate, every Wednesday morning, we meet in the Spirit of Jesus. We've been doing it ever since Doug started this many years ago. And this is it's all scripturally based. It's actually Acts 2:42. You get together, do 4 things: eat together, pray together, fellowship together, and talk about the precepts of Jesus together. So all of that was happening. And I would say that he died, but not until he quietly told Jesus to every country around the world. And I can just say that Doug's going to have a very Merry Christmas.